August, climate justice advocate Mitzi Janelle is clear that the climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. While most people consider the environment a scientific problem to be fixed by the scientists, the Filipino youth activist is determined to put an empowering human aspect into the climate crisis battle involving everyday people. Her optimism surrounding the ability of youth to move the needle towards climate action is contagious. When we unite, there is so much power there, she told UN News' Liz Gafidi.
The climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis, and it's something that we don't see the links as often in mainstream media and the way we talk about the climate crisis. Although more and more it's starting to change, but we're still seeing how people talk about the climate crisis as an environmental problem, something that's a scientific problem to be fixed by the scientists and the world leaders, but not something that people, everyday people, can be involved with because they are impacted themselves. So it lacks that empowering human aspect, which I think needs to be talked about.
What is it you want others around the world to do to highlight climate action?
So on World Humanitarian Day, just like any other day of the year, I will be campaigning for climate justice, really bringing attention to how the people who are most marginalized, people who are most vulnerable, people who are least responsible for the climate crisis, they're the ones who are most affected. And these are also the people who have the greatest stories of resistance, and these are the stories that we have to be amplifying and listening to, because if we don't listen to the voices who are most marginalized, we'll end up with climate action that leaves people behind. And that's not the climate action that we want or that we need. We want climate justice that includes everyone, development that includes everyone. But I want others around the world to highlight climate action. Really, at its core, climate justice is just about caring about people who are outside your immediate bubble. It's about caring about people who are the most marginalized and recognizing their agency to lead and seeing that they actually know what they need. We just need to listen to them and empower them and build their capacity to do this.
Are you hopeful that the need for climate action is a message that is getting through?
There are days when I'm not as hopeful, but generally, I honestly just believe in the revolutionary power of the youth. It amazes me how if you look at every single historical moment in society, the youth have been there leading the way with the most marginalized sectors of society. And when I remember that the youth is part of every sector of society. We're in the workers, we're in the middle class, we're in the LGBT groups, we're in the racial justice groups, we're everywhere because there's a young person in all these sectors. So when we unite, there's so much power there. And when we learn from each other and we realize how really climate justice is just about building a community that cares about each other. That's the future that we've been fighting for. And when I think of it that way, when I think of how there's so many of us coming together, fighting for the same thing in different ways and learning from each other, then for me it's impossible for us to not get that better future that we're fighting for.
It seems that every day we hear how climate change is affecting everyone. Can you speak to the impact it's having on humanitarian efforts?
We're seeing how more and more people are having to do humanitarian work because of the impacts of the climate crisis. So it's not just whenever there are extreme weather events like typhoons and droughts, but it's also the increased risk of forced migration and refugees and the human rights issues that come along with that, the social justice issues that come along with that. So I really think that climate action is more than just drastic emission cuts. It ties in with humanitarian efforts and making sure that we are able to adapt, making sure that when people are being impacted by these effects, there is a way for reparations for the loss and damages that they've experienced, and in the end, that's really a humanitarian effort.
How can the world focus on climate action in relation to humanitarian work and humanitarian aid?
There's this concept in the Philippines called bayanihan, which I have absolutely no clue how to translate, and I guess the best way to translate it is coming together as one community, coming together when there's someone in need for the public good. And I think that's what we should be looking at when we approach climate justice and climate action, the same way we approach humanitarian work and humanitarian aid. Why do we do it? Because we care about people. Because we're building a community, not the way that society has taught us, that community is just the people you're familiar with, the people that look like you, but really a community of everyone coming together because this is one planet that we're fighting for. That's how I think we should be approaching it.
What can the UN do to help encourage these actions?
I think the UN has a powerful voice, and has such a big platform to amplify these voices of resistance. I think something that lacks in a lot of humanitarian work is that empowering aspect. I've seen, at least currently for the Philippines, I've seen that we've been portrayed as some people who are helpless, people who need to be saved. And that's not the kind of humanitarian work that we want. The kind of humanitarian work that we need is the kind that's empowering and that makes us work together rather than helping the people who are marginalized. And that's something that we need to really focus on more and really shift the narrative from being a voice for the voiceless, but rather amplifying the voices. Shifting it from fighting for people and fighting alongside people. Shifting it from giving people food to giving people ways to cook.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
I've already said it, but I would really, really like to emphasize that the climate crisis has to shift away from being an environmental issue that's so separated from people. A lot of people say that, oh, the climate crisis is a middle-class issue. It's something that people who are starving, people who don't have a house to live, can connect with. But the thing is, these are the people who are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. But we've kept it away from them for so long because we've talked about the climate crisis as something about the environment, about carbon dioxide emissions. We've kept the science and climate crisis so separated from the people, and that's what we need to do. We need to come back to that. We need to come back to just building community.
Hello, in today's show, efforts to reassure thousands of children traumatized by the fighting in Tigray, Ethiopia. The UN Health Agency announces new potential wonder drugs to fight COVID, heat waves and potentially record temperatures in the Mediterranean, and unsettling news from Afghanistan amid the lightning Taliban advance. All this and more in this week's UN Catch-Up Dateline Geneva. Thanks for listening. First, the news with Katie Dunford.
This is the news in brief from United Nations. 3 new candidate drugs are being tested in the latest phase of global trials to find effective treatments against COVID-19, the World Health Organization's announced. The therapies, artesunate, imatinib and infliximab, will be tested on hospitalized coronavirus patients in 52 countries under the Solidarity Plus program. The drugs are already being used to treat other conditions. There have been more than 203 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, according to the WHO, which noted that the world hit the 200 million mark last week, just 6 months after infections passed 100 million. Speaking in Geneva, agency chief Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus underscored the critical need to find more effective and accessible COVID-19 therapeutics. He said that although oxygen, dexamethasone and IL-6 blockers were effective in treating patients, we need more for patients at all ends of the clinical spectrum, from mild to severe disease. Tedros insisted that health workers needed to be trained to use these therapeutics too. 3 drugs were selected by an independent panel for their potential in reducing the risk of death in people hospitalized for COVID-19. UN weather experts said on Thursday that they're actively looking into a possible record temperature for continental Europe of 48.8 degrees Celsius, 119.8 degrees Fahrenheit in the town of Siracusa in Sicily. The World Meteorological Organization said it could not yet confirm or deny the temperature reading, which was taken on Wednesday by an agricultural forecasting service on the island and not the official Italian weather service. Only days ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report highlighting the indisputable impact of human activity on extreme weather events. The WMO said that a rapid response team is now in contact with the Sicilian Weather Service in order to decide if this new temperature spike beats Europe's existing high of 48 degrees Celsius, 118.4 degrees Fahrenheit, Athens on the 10th of July, 1977. The development comes amid fresh heatwave alerts and concerns over wildfires in Algeria, where the National Weather Service forecasts temperatures of at least 44 degrees Celsius or 111.2 degrees Fahrenheit, with highs of perhaps 47 degrees Celsius or 116.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The extent of the massive forest blazes in the North African country were clearly visible from space and published on Tuesday by NASA. One image captured by the Aqua satellite showed a vast plume of smoke over northern Algeria, where more than 62,000 hectares have burnt so far this year, according to the European Forest Fire Information System. Disturbing reports of Taliban violence against communities now under their control in Afghanistan have been condemned by UN Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet. The High Commissioner for Human Rights said on Tuesday that there was fear and dread across Afghanistan, which had driven people to flee their homes. The development comes as Taliban forces reportedly took control of Ghazni city, 130 kilometers or 80 miles southwest of the capital Kabul. The extremist group has also been engaged in fierce fighting in Lashkargah, one of Afghanistan's biggest cities, and reportedly released prisoners from jail in Kandahar city, the country's second largest. In Geneva, UN Rights Office spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani said that people rightly feared that the Taliban would erase the human rights gains out of the past 2 decades, as US and international forces continue to pull out of Afghanistan.
We've already documented 183 civilians, but we do fear that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. The 1,181 who have already been documented to be injured, we don't know how many of them might succumb to their injuries. People are living in fear and dread. Women are already being killed and shot for breaching rules that have been imposed on what they can wear and on where they can move without a male escort.
Since the 9th of July, the UN Rights Office has confirmed almost 200 civilian fatalities in 4 Afghan cities. Another 1,200 have been injured. Katie Dartford, UN News.
The headlines there, and this is UN Catch-Up Dateline Geneva with me, Daniel Johnson. Now to this week's interview, a rare chance to hear from Tigray, where spiralling conflict that started last November between Ethiopian government forces and separatists has created a humanitarian catastrophe in the north of the country. As ever, it's the women and children who've suffered most after fleeing for their lives in many cases. Imagine the impact on young minds. On the ground to help them in Shire are mental health counsellors from the UN's migration agency IOM. For the latest, I spoke to media officer Kay Viray from the International Organization for Migration in Ethiopia, and here she is now.
If you can imagine, IOM have set up a mental health and psychosocial support clinic in one of the IDP sites, an overcrowded IDP site in Shire, and next to it is an IOM fixed clinic as well, which provide medical consultations, other pharmacy and other services by different medical professionals. That's not only just the IDPs but also the host communities within this IDP sites.
So these are internally displaced people. Sorry, I know we do fall into acronyms at the United Nations, but these are internally displaced people from the Tigray conflict. What's the latest from Shire? I'm not sure when you were last there, but what can you tell us about how many people have been displaced so far from this conflict in northern Ethiopia?
Yes, so based on IOM's latest displacement tracking matrix, or DTM as we call it, we do emergency site assessment, and we're already on the round 6. And on this latest round, which I believe covers the whole month of May, we have identified nearly 2 million internally displaced persons in Tigray and neighboring regions of Tigray, Amara and Afar. So that is from 2 months ago, so you can imagine that it is probably more than 2 million at the moment.
And how many people is this IOM psychosocial center catering for?
It differs. Like, for example, in Shire, where we have the fixed clinic, we have hundreds of people who come every week. Sometimes our colleagues in IOM who work at the center, they work 7 days a week, sometimes from day until night, because the cases are unexpected. And in some areas of northern Ethiopia, for example in Mekelle, we have mobile health teams and also psychosocial teams. So they're not in the actual IDP sites, but they travel from different IDP sites every day, and also every day they have hundreds of people coming in for different reasons, like cough, colds, or pregnant ladies.
That was really one of my questions. How many children are you actually helping? We're trying to get to the bottom of the extent of mental health trauma and psychosocial issues among youngsters.
In Shire, we have helped so far 15,500 for MHPSS, which is mental health and psychosocial support.
And how long has the support been there in Shire?
We started in Shire in February this year. As you know, the conflict broke out in November, and in the beginning of the conflict, it was really hard to access a lot of the areas in the north. But as soon as we were able to, we started helping in all ways possible, including mental health and psychosocial support, of course.
You talk about difficulties of getting access, but what are the concerns about those people you can't reach because of ongoing military conflict?
We do not know exactly how many are unreachable or which areas people are in at the moment, because the mobility is really hard to record. But in the areas that we have access to, we are already struggling to provide the necessary services to them. So while we are able to access them, the focus for us is really to be able to respond to those people who we can reach on a daily basis. So for example, in IOM, we have over 40 million funding gap. So you can imagine how much more we will need when we are able to access and get to the places that we have never been yet.
Can we talk quickly about the children that you are helping? I understand you're not a psychologist, but what's the approach to getting children to open up and to reassure them that they are in a safe space? It must be extremely difficult in what is effectively somewhere that's not far from a conflict zone.
No, Daniel, it truly is very hard. I mean, when I visited one of the sites in Shire, I can already see that some of them, are very scared to see another foreign person coming to the IDP site. And, we have this thing we call like an assessment fatigue from them, where they always see people coming in and then eventually they leave, and then they wait for something to change and nothing happens. So there is already that kind of fear from them, and sometimes, just fatigue just to see all these new faces coming and then going. But when I visited one of the IDP sites in Shire, I met this young, enthusiastic, energetic boy named Teddy. He is 12 years old. And that day that I met him, he was really happy and was really excited to share stories from the IDP side, from his past experiences as a student. But then I was told that the day before, he was completely the opposite person, heavily distressed by the conflict. I was able to speak to one of the parents in the site, and she told me that one day there was a truck who was unloading some heavy trucks, and it made a very loud gun-like sound, and she saw all the kids running under a table and covering their ears and crying. And to me, I didn't see this personally, but just the idea of this happening really, to me, was so sad and disturbing. So you can imagine how much distress and even trauma some of these kids have to go through. I can't even imagine how hard it must be to live day by day, not knowing if you're going to have food the next day, or are you going to be happy the next day, or are you going to see your friends again the next day, or will they be moving to another IDP site? So I think the constant uncertainty and distress really, for me, has struck me the most when I met them, some of these children in the IOM MHPSS clinic.
I mean, it might sound obvious to say that conflict affects a child's development. Well, why exactly? What is it that conflict does to a child's emotional state?
It is basically a fact for any human being, young or old, that the part of our human development is that our mental health and psychosocial well-being and social relations, they happen every day, and they are, linked to each other. But when there is this disruption and an uncertainty and a certain amount of fear, like that comes out, for example, of a conflict and other emergencies, then you can imagine how these intertwining links are just suddenly disrupted and just going in different places. I mean, I am not an expert, but I can imagine that it is not easy, and to see how to find ways to cope from that, I think it really is a huge challenge, and sometimes overlooked in certain situations, like an emergency situation. So in IOM, this is something that we want to fill the gap, and we're not obviously, we can't do it overnight, but as a start, I think it's already doing a big change to these IDPs.
My thanks then to Media Officer Kay Virey from the International Organisation for Migration in Ethiopia, who saw firsthand how the mental health counsellors are working around the clock to help children displaced by the Tigray conflict. For today's interview, I also spoke to the agency's mental health and psychosocial support officer, Amel Sahal, who's based in Shire, and she told me that more than 15,500 children have been helped in Tigray since the conflict started last November. That is some achievement, as I learned that it's often the case that children are unable to properly express or explain their feelings, thoughts and behaviour. And I should say that Amel explained also that children lack the basic things: a safe space, a place to play and learn, all the things that everyone needs, and particularly youngsters, for healthy development and mental well-being. And she appealed to the international community not to forget them. My thanks to her. Now it's time for some closing thoughts from Solange Behatege-Cortez. Hi Solange, I know this is a tough subject to land on you, but what are your takeaways?
Hola Daniel. Well, children have been some of the worst victims of conflicts in Tigray. Many of them have witnessed things no child should ever see. They are children harboring adult fears, living in vulnerable bodies on the front lines of violence. While a normal child cries about the witch in a fairy tale, displaced children in Tigray are frightened by the sound of guns, by the shadow of a rapist. In their nightmares, they are hungry and see themselves dead. The interview reminds me of a poem by American author Emily Dickinson. She wrote, "I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. Daniel, I felt a funeral in my brain." I keep repeating this strong stanza, and then I think of these children in Tigray. Are they imagining their own funeral? Quite possible. Some pain doesn't leave any mark. That's why the work that our colleagues at the International Organization for Migration, IOM, are doing in mental health clinics is so crucial for the well-being of internally displaced people, to help them to understand and put words to what they are experiencing. K.B. Ray, who we just heard, mentioned Teddy, a young boy who one day seems happy, but the next can be totally disturbed and lost in uncertainty. He said that in the future he would like to be an IOM worker to help other children like him. He said, "Maybe someday I can even be the director of IOM." This is so powerful, Daniel. There is still life in his dreams. But I think we must be careful with children's dreams so that they are not broken. I think that all Teddys of the world deserve to have heads that are full of dreams, not funerals.
Thank you, Solange. Of course children should have their dreams and they should be able to fulfill them. And just to return quickly to what IOM's mental health officer, Amel Sahal, told me, she said that although many children do recover from distressing events by themselves, what's really important is support from mental health counsellors early on, as this can help to prevent them developing serious psychosocial problems later on in life. She said that concerns about the many thousands of children who humanitarians still can't help in conflict-affected areas really bother humanitarians, and the unaccompanied minors who've lost their parents too. This is a terrible situation, and it clearly isn't the last time we'll be talking about Tigray. On that sobering note, it's time to wrap things up, Solange. Thank you for your thoughts, as ever, and you two listeners for being with us. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Please join us next time. Bye-bye for now.
Ciao Daniel, hasta el próximo viernes.
Hello again. Before I sign off, here's news of a brand new audio series you might like. It's the UN Climate podcast, No Denying It. It features young climate changemakers from across our warming planet who show us how we can make a positive impact in our daily lives. Listen in wherever you get your podcasts every Thursday from the 26th of August.
young people, from the first time in several centuries, they don't believe that their life will be better than their fathers.
There's no denying it. Stopping climate change is simple. We need to stop digging up fossil fuels and burning them just to get energy.
Our current climate crisis is directly linked to colonization when we think of colonization as a system that's always thinking about extraction.
It's hard to focus on individual rights or wealth inequality if literally they can't breathe the air or there's fires pushing them out of their communities or their home.
Quitting our addiction to fossil fuels is going to take solutions in every industry, at every scale, in every nation on the planet.
It's not because of CO2, it's because we approached the planet with an unbalanced worldview. And so, of course, eventually, the world became unbalanced. So if we can take some lessons and teachings from indigenous cultures, if we as individuals can hold a balanced view in our minds, then it's just a matter of time before the world balances as well.
Our vision is to be able to replicate this process in every part of the world that there is sea and fishermen.
It made you understand your place better, made you feel really humble and want to work a lot to preserve the well-being of this planet that has existed so many ages.
No denying it, the UN Climate Action Podcast brings you the voices of young climate changemakers from across our warming planet. These activists, engineers, and entrepreneurs show us how we can make big changes in our homes, our jobs, where we vote and pray, and with our family and friends.
I believe everyone is put in this world for a purpose. And my purpose was always to create a dent in the universe by impacting the environment space. That is my purpose.
We all have to start somewhere, but the important thing is to get started. There's no denying it. Find No Denying It, the United Nations Climate Action Podcast, wherever you listen.